Good afternoon, and welcome to the William G. McGowan Theater here at the National Archives. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and I'm pleased you could join us this noon, whether you're here in the theater or joining us on our YouTube station. Before we hear from Lynn Vincent and Sara Vladic about their new book, Indianapolis, the true story of the worst sea disaster in U.S. naval history, I'd like to tell you about two other programs coming up next month here in the McGowan Theater. On Tuesday, September 11th at noon, political historian Sean Valence will be here to tell us about his new book, No Property in Man, Slavery and Anti-Slavery at the Nation's Founding. He'll discuss the political and legal struggles over slavery that began during the Revolutionary War and concluded with the Civil War. Then on Tuesday, September 18th at noon, Kyle Longley, the newly appointed director of the Lyndon Baines Johnson Presidential Library, will examine the tumultuous year of 1968 and how President Johnson perceived that year's most significant events. His book is LBJ's 1968, Power, Politics, and the Presidency in America's Year of Upheaval. Check out our website, archives.gov, or sign up at the table outside the theater to get email updates. You'll also find information about other National Archives programs and activities. And another way to get more involved in the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports all of our education and outreach activity, and there are applications for membership in the lobby. I often refer to the stories that are in the National Archives. We're not just a storehouse. The billions of pages and miles of film in our care hold countless stories of our past. In these records, you can discover human lives and how the great and small events of history changed them. Today, we'll hear the stories of the men who sailed the USS Indianapolis during World War II. The cruiser sinking in July 1945, just weeks before Japan's surrender ended the war, was the worst sea disaster in U.S. naval history. Historical records can also help answer questions and unravel mysteries even decades after the events took place. Last summer's identification of the location of the wreck of the Indianapolis was aided by a historian's discovery in the deck log that a landing craft had seen the Indianapolis the night before she sank. And just this month, the Navy was able to settle a question about the number of survivors because of research done in the records housed in our facility in College Park and our National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis. Some stories are easily told, others take 73 years to come to light. By preserving the records of our past, we ensure that the building blocks of our stories will be available now and far into the future. Lynn Vincent, a U.S. Navy veteran, is the #1 New York Times bestselling author and co-author of 11 nonfiction books. Her best-known titles are Same of Kind of Different as Me and Heaven is for Real. A veteran journalist and author of more than 1,000 articles, her investigative pieces have been cited before Congress and the U.S. Supreme Court. Sara Vladic, an acclaimed documentary filmmaker, is one of the world's leading experts on the USS Indianapolis, having become obsessed with the story at the age of 13. Over the next 2 decades, Vladic met and interviewed 108 of the ship's survivors, and in 2016 she released an award-winning documentary film of the disaster, USS Indianapolis: The Legacy. She's published new research on Indianapolis in Proceedings, the official journal of the U.S. Navy, and appeared as an expert commentator on PBS's USS Indianapolis Live from the Deep, which explored the ship's records. The book is also listed on the New York Times bestseller list. So before they come to the stage, we're going to see a short film. So if you'll roll the film now.
I started into the Navy when I was 16, and I saw all 10 battles.
I saw the flag raised, and that was Sara Vladic.
And I personally helped load and unload components of the atomic bomb.
On the 30th of July, we were hit by 2 torpedoes from a submarine and sunk.
Next thing I know, the ship's going right out from under me.
I never did know how to swim, and the Navy never taught me how to swim.
And here's all these sharks going around. Come right across your legs like that.
It was chaos.
We couldn't understand why we weren't rescued.
A lot of them lost the will to live.
Us guys decided, well, hell, that's where we're going to die.
Then there on that 4th day, I said, I hear a plane. And we began to splash water, we began to yell, we began to pray, everything. And seemingly when he got to a point that had he gone any further, he would have gone over, but you know what he did? He made a dive.
How did I make it with nothing to eat, no water to drink, no sleep for 5 nights? Tell him the Lord was with me.
If somebody wrote this up as fiction, nobody would believe it happened.
People don't realize the politics in the armed forces.
All the headlines were about the captain being court-martialed.
Many a head should have rolled before they ever got to the captain.
It's the story that's not been told. Those don't want to remember, they don't want to recall this. It's too much. But I'm a dummy. I think it ought to be told.
You know how when politicians come out to speak and then they point at somebody in the audience? I've always wondered if they were faking that. Here we have someone who was in that film just now.
Thank you all for coming. And my mic works so good to fix it. I'd like to start this talk out with a question for you all. By a show of hands, who can tell me that, or who first learned of the story of Indianapolis by watching the movie Jaws? Quite a few.
Raise them high, raise them high.
And what about other sources, documentaries, the news? How, show of hands, who else heard of it? All right, who hadn't heard about it until maybe the last week or two?
Few.
Few, yeah. So I heard about it when I was 13 years old, and I was watching a documentary with my father. And it was about the Pacific War, and the story of the Indianapolis was reduced to a single line, which was, it was the ship that carried the bomb and was sunk. And I thought, well, there's got to be more to it than that. And so I went to the library. At that time, there was no Google, and so my dad told me to go look it up, and I think it was Grolier Encyclopedia. that had it. And again, it was not in any major books. There was very little to be found about it. And so kept looking, found some stuff, but thought, someone's got to tell this story someday. And I thought by the time I was old enough to do it, someone else would already have done it. And I graduated college from Pepperdine, and no one had heard about it. No one was talking about it. It still hadn't been made. And so that's when I decided to look for the survivors of the Indianapolis. And that's when Ask Jeeves was around, and dating myself. And so Jeeves said there was Paul Murphy and Mary Lou Murphy, and they were the chairman and secretary of the survivors organization. And so I called them up, and they invited me to a reunion. I said, I'd love to meet you and talk to you. And so they invited me to the reunion. And that was the first time I was able to meet some of the Indianapolis survivors. And it was a big year. It was the year that a lot of things happened with the captain's records, and we'll talk about that more this afternoon. But it was really a very ceremonial year. There were a lot of events, and that was the first time I talked to these men and got to know them, and they invited me to come back. And over the next couple years, I got to know them and their families. And over a Denny's breakfast a couple years later, I was a poor, just graduated college kid, and they said, we want you to be our storyteller. And so, you know, you don't say no to that. When a World War II veteran says they want you to be your storyteller, you go to task, you do the work. And so at the time I wanted to make a movie. I wanted to write a screenplay, and I needed to interview these men in order to do the story. I thought, you can't tell it unless you talk to the people who lived it. So started doing interviews in 2005, and wrote a screenplay, took it to a major network, and they said, this is the best thing we've seen since Band of Brothers, but it needs to be based on a book. I was like, I don't know how to write a book. And so I asked friends and family, do you know anyone who knows how to write a book? Screenplays are very different, by the way, you know. And so through it ended up being my mother-in-law, I was introduced to Lynn Vincent, who at the time had a few bestsellers, so it was very intimidating, and I didn't want to mess it up. So I called her hoping she would give me some advice. Actually, I emailed her first, saying, could you call me? I just need 5 minutes. I'm sure she had a million people asking this. She just had a book, or a couple books come out that you might have heard of, Heaven is for Real, same kind of different as me. So I was very intimidated, and I called, and she gave me 5 minutes of her time, and that was our first phone call.
Yes, and what she didn't know, what Sara didn't know when she called, is that I'm a Navy veteran, number one. Number two, that I was an investigative journalist before I transitioned to books. And number three, that I had literally been praying for an iconic World War II story to write. Now, there are World War II stories that are as iconic as Indianapolis, but none that are more so. And so when she called me, I was like, oh, God's answering my prayer. But all she wants is advice. What am I going to do? I didn't want to jump on her and force myself on her. But after a few conversations, we agreed to team up, and then we had our first meeting.
And I like to tell the story of the first meeting because it kind of sets the tone for this. But as I mentioned earlier, she had written Heaven is for Real and Same Kind of Different as Me, both very Christian stories. And so we'd only spoken on the phone, and I thought when we were going to show up, I was looking for the woman in the sweater set carrying a Bible. And she showed up on a Harley. And so I kind of knew from that point that this would be a good working relationship, and it really was. From the beginning, it has been a blessing. It has been an incredible experience. I'm going to say for both of us.
Yeah, not only great writing partners, but great friends. So it's been a blast. Right on this tour, we've been eating our way across the Southeast, so we've been having a really good time.
Yes. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that sometimes we get asked, you know, there have been other books written about Indianapolis, you know, what's new? What are you guys going to do that's different? And one of the things that I like to say is, you know, there have been worthy books written about Indianapolis. The first one was in 1959 by an Associated Press editor named Richard Newcomb. And he was the first journalist to realize that this was, first of all, a horrible tragedy, really a bookend to Pearl Harbor in terms of one began the war and the other ended the war. And second, he was the first to realize that Captain McVeigh, the skipper of Indianapolis, had suffered a grave injustice. So that was the first book, and that actually triggered the survivors' reunions. That the first time they got together for a reunion in Indianapolis, the city, was 1960. And then, 30 years or so later, another reporter, an iron-chinned journalist of the old school named Dan Kurzman, wrote another book. Now, you have to remember that archives and records continue to be classified. And some things had been declassified by the time Kurzman wrote his book, but not everything, including the Ultra program, which was the most highly classified intelligence program of the war. So there remain things that weren't revealed, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the archives in a moment. And then in 2001, an author named Doug Stanton wrote In Harm's Way, which was really the first book to explore the experience, the horrific nightmare experience of the survivors in the water. How many of you have read that? That was a really great book. About 80% of it took place in the water. What we tried to do was help people remember that Indianapolis is much more than a sinking story. For decades, it's been recognized as sort of a disaster story, a sinking story, a shark story. I mean, how many of you every year on Shark Week, they roll out the Indianapolis as the worst shark attack in history. But Indianapolis was so much more than a shark story or a sinking story. She was actually the flagship of the Fifth Fleet, the ship from whose decks Admiral Raymond Spruance strategized and plotted out the Pacific War. So you could argue that she was one of the most important vessels in the Pacific War. So we tried to bring that out for readers. Would you like to talk about some other things that we did that are different?
One of the things we really tried to do was to go back to the original source material. As Lynn mentioned, there were quite a few other books and 70 years of interpretations and sharing of stories and a little bit of The Fish Got Bigger, that kind of thing. And so we really wanted to go back to primary sources to do this story or to do this book. And to do that, we went to the archives. We went to College Park and spent a lot of time there, and we wanted to stay there forever until they kicked us out. Yes. And so, you know, if they would let us put a sleeping bag in there, I think we would have stayed.
I would have.
And so, you know, we spent an incredible amount of time there. We went to the Naval War College. We went to the Library of Congress, and then also were able to interview over 107 of the survivors, the rescue crew, and the families of those who were lost at sea in order to really tell the firsthand accounts of what took place, not only during the sinking, but in the, you know, in service to the country. So these battle stars, you remember these are 16, 17, 18-year-old kids commanding, you know, these vessels. Well, not commanding, but they were running the vessels. They were steering the ship. They were actively participating in these battles. And so those perspectives, firsthand accounts of what was taking place during Okinawa and Iwo Jima, and because they were at the front of the picket line, so they were, you know, viewing distance from these invasions and watching this, witnessing what was happening at that time. And so we wanted to go back to that. We also went back to the letters, you know, the correspondence between husbands and wives or girlfriends and sailors as they were writing back and forth on the ship, and kind of, you know, their love stories and what was happening on the home front. You know, there was a gentleman by the name of Lieutenant Commander Earl Henry, who was the dentist aboard the ship. And he had gone home, right, but, you know, there was a kamikaze attack in March of 1945. It was the day before Okinawa was invaded. And the kamikaze struck the Indianapolis. 9 men were killed. And they went into dry docks in Mare Island to repair this. And that was kind of the first domino that sent the ship into the mission of carrying components for the atomic bomb. And so when the ship was in dry dock in Mare Island, or San Francisco area, this gentleman went home and visited his wife, who was very pregnant at the time, and, you know, was able to spend a little time with her. But 3 days after he was recalled back to the ship, when his leave ended, Earl Jr. was born. And so there's the letters between Earl and his wife, Earl Sr. and his wife, and he was able to receive some pictures right before the final mission, where they had just delivered components of the bomb, and were then going to Leyte to prepare for the invasion of Japan. So he received, photographs of young Earl, who was born prematurely, and ran around the ship carrying the photo, showing everyone he could how excited he was about his brand new son. So those kind of things we like to incorporate in the story, and the firsthand accounts, as I mentioned. We wanted you to get to know these men in the way we were privileged to in the years of interviews. So it's a look through the lens of these men at what was taking place in 1945 all the way through exonerating the captain.
And speaking of the bomb mission, again, holding up and lifting up libraries, one of the things Sara mentioned before was that when she first heard of Indianapolis, the bomb mission was reduced to just a line in a documentary, and we found that to be true of books as well, that it's the ship that carried components of the atomic bomb. But no one ever told that story, which was really strange to us because that was the most highly classified naval mission of the war. And so when we were at the Library of Congress right here in this city, we found the private papers of a man named Robert Furman, who was an Army major. And it just so happened that Major Furman was the chief intelligence officer for the entire Manhattan Project. And he had run around Europe trying to track down the state of German atomic science, because the scientists on the American side were really worried that the Germans were going to beat the United States in being able to deploy an operational atomic bomb during the war. So in Furman's records were all of these handwritten accounts, day by day, moment by moment, of transporting the atomic bomb, the components of the atomic bomb, the fissionable components of the atomic bomb, aboard USS Indianapolis. And so we see that mission in our book, both from his perspective, not just as an Army officer, but how he got to know the officers, the Navy officers on Indianapolis, and also from the perspective of the men, because the money components of the atomic bomb were carried in two cylindrical canisters, which were very heavy because one of them carried uranium, which was at that time among the heaviest of natural elements. And so Major Furman and his partner, Captain James Nolan, kind of secretly and nonchalantly had those carried into their quarters. And meanwhile, they made a big deal out of this automobile-sized crate that they secured in the aircraft hangar aboard Indianapolis. And what they were trying to do was divert the attention of the crew. The crew knew that something really secret was happening, and they didn't know what it was. And Major Furman and Captain Nolan decided that they would make a big production and post a Marine guard around this big crate to divert the crew's attention. So tell them what the crew did.
So again, these are teenagers, and their curiosity led them to betting. So they took bets what was happening or what was being transported in this giant crate, and there was everything from Rita Hayworth's undergarments to scented toilet paper for General MacArthur. Of course, none of them guessed what was actually in the crate. But there's another story another part of the book that we bring into the story is the Japanese perspective. And we have the journals and the notes of Admiral Yotome Yugake, who was the kamikaze. He was in charge of the kamikaze program. And so his letters and the letters of the young kamikaze pilots who ultimately committed suicide in honor of their emperor. In addition to that, as we mentioned, the home front, I have here in the audience Jim Belcher Jr. His father served aboard the Indianapolis, and he has an incredible story, and his family has an incredible story in that, spoiler alert, he survived, his father survived, and when he came home, he married a Japanese woman. And we had the incredible privilege of interviewing their family in that, she at the time was in school learning and preparing about the invasion of Japan and what they would be called to do, training, these young students to fight with sticks for the invasion. They were going to fight to the end, and what happened from the Japanese side and their perspective of the atomic bomb and what that meant and how happy they were that it ended the war. And so, after the war, flash forward a couple years, and James Belcher Sr. marries this lovely young woman, and they have a family together. And so, you know, the healing that came from that, and that story, and the home front, and that perspective. So that's another part of it that we include that's really kind of a personal experience and perspective of how the Indianapolis and what took place in World War II carried on through present day.
The story continues after the rescue. The rescue is tremendously exciting, especially for people like Jim Belcher, whose father survived. Jim, will you stand up, please? Jim's father survived the sinking of Indianapolis. Thanks, Jim. For those of you who raised your hands that said you just have only recently heard of this story, I mentioned Indianapolis was the flagship of the Pacific Fleet. Sara mentioned the kamikaze attack that sent the ship back to Mare Island for repairs. On July 16, 1945, Indianapolis and Captain McVeigh were tapped for the bomb mission, as I mentioned. No one aboard the ship knew exactly what was in the crate and the canisters. They made a speed run to Pearl Harbor, 74.5 hours. That's a record that still stands today for that class of ship. And then they went to Tinian Island in the northern Marianas. They arrived there on July 26, and that's when Lieutenant Commander Earl Henry received those photographs of the child that he would never meet. And 4 days later, they set out from Guam to Leyte on a routine mission. In those days, at that time of the war, that Route Petty, was considered sort of the backwater of the war. It was considered the rear. And so the Navy did not send an escort ship with Indianapolis. In those days, cruisers did not have sonar or any kind of underwater detection equipment, so they were usually accompanied by destroyers or destroyer escorts to protect against enemy submarines. They did not send an escort with Captain McVeigh, even though the Navy had intelligence that a group of 4 attack submarines was headed down into the southern Philippine Sea on offensive missions, sort of last-ditch offensive missions. They were determined to sink as many American ships as they could because they knew that the war was almost over and that one way or the other, Japan was going to be on the losing side. So a few minutes after midnight on July 30th, 1945, which was really just a few hours ago, this week was the 73rd anniversary of the sinking. Lieutenant Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto encountered Indianapolis in the center of the Philippine Sea, 280 miles from the nearest land. He fired a spread of 6 torpedoes. 2 of them hit Indianapolis. 1 of them blew the bow mostly off the ship, and the second one hit Indianapolis amidships. About 300 of the crew of 1,195 men went down with the ship, including, we believe, Lieutenant Commander Henry, the dentist, and about 900 men made it into the water alive. They stayed there for 5 nights and 4 days, which we can explain in a moment why that happened. But after those 5 nights and 4 days, only 316 men survived. They are rescued beginning on August 2nd, 1945, and afterwards, the Navy has to decide who to pin this on. And what they decide is to court-martial the captain, Captain McVeigh, even though they didn't give him the proper intelligence, even though they didn't give him an escort ship. And one of the things that we did afresh was to examine the primary source documents for the court-martial of Captain McVeigh, and without 73 years of interpretation. And because of the National Archives, we found what we believe is a smoking gun as to why Captain McVeigh's court-martial was rushed ahead. Because of the primary sources in the National Archives, we found that the court-martial and persecution, really, of McVeigh was much worse than we thought. And then comes a 50-year effort to exonerate the captain. And that effort was led by the survivors themselves and by a young boy who learned about Indianapolis and talked about it for a school history fair project and brought much attention to the story in the late 1990s, 50 years after the fact. And then the third person who was critical to helping to exonerate Captain McVeigh was the captain of the namesake submarine, USS Indianapolis, SSN 697, and his name is Captain Bill Tody, and we're lucky enough to have Captain Bill Tody with us today.
And so, you know, we mentioned In Harm's Way that was written in 2001. Well, when that was written, none of the exoneration had really happened. I mean, it was underway, but there was not a conclusion by the time that Doug wrote his book. And so we had the privilege to tell the story of what takes place, you know, in between 1998, well, from 1960 when the earnest effort began all the way through 1998 where it really started to take ground, and then into present day where they did exonerate Captain McVeigh in 2001. But that was really a huge effort in part by Bill Tody and Senator Warner, Senator Bob Smith, a lot of back and forth, and it wasn't smooth sailing. I mean, forgive the pun. But it was an effort by many to get to this point to where the captain's name could be cleared.
Yeah, and talk about back and forth, it was decades. It was decades of fighting, because every time an exoneration effort would be mounted, the Navy would push back and say, this court-martial was legally justified. So that went on decade after decade. First the survivors, then Captain McVeigh's sons, when they got older, they wrote to President Reagan, they wrote to Vice President Bush, and each time they were told the court-martial is legally sound, number one. Number two, presidents don't have the ability to overturn a Navy court-martial. So those letters happened in the 80s. And then in the 90s, remember I told you about Dan Kurzman. Dan Kurzman found what he considered another smoking gun, and that was also in the National Archives. And he found a letter which indicated that even the Navy knew that Captain McVeigh was convicted on what they called a super technical charge. And then in the 1990s, here came young Hunter Scott, the 11-year-old boy who began to correspond with the survivors. Mm-hmm. And then a man that many of you are familiar with got involved in the exoneration effort. How many of you have ever heard of Joe Scarborough? He's on MSNBC, he has the show Morning Joe. Well, at that time, he was a congressman from Florida, and he happened to be in Hunter's district. And he put Hunter's 6th grade history project on display in his congressional office in the 1st District in Florida. And pretty soon that gathered a whole bunch of attention because it was just made for TV. And I see some young men up there. How old are you guys? 10? 7? So Hunter was only 11 when he started this. And he began to write to the survivors. And as I said, Congressman Scarborough got wind of it. And the next thing he knew, Hunter Scott was all over TV. This was in 1997, 96 through basically 99. He was everywhere. He was on the Tom Brokaw Nightly News. He was on all the, like, David Letterman. There was a magazine years ago called George Magazine, and they named this 11-year-old boy one of the 20 most interesting men in politics. But it was made for TV because it was, you know, young boy helps elderly survivors in their exoneration quest. And so, but still, when the exoneration quest reached Congress, the Navy still pushed back and pushed back and pushed back. And this gentleman here, Captain Bill Tody, did a little bit of behind the scenes stuff to finally help everything go through, as did, ironically, Lieutenant Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto. Even after the Senate Armed Services Committee in September of 1999, Senator John Warner would not put the resolution to exonerate Captain McVeigh on the Senate floor. He wouldn't do it, he wouldn't do it. Senator Bob Smith was saying, please take it to a vote. And Senator Warner would always say, the Navy's decided this, the Navy decided this decades ago, and they keep deciding it. It wasn't until Lieutenant Commander Hashimoto wrote a letter to Senator Warner saying, in effect, can't we take this terrible burden off this captain? It wasn't his fault. Can't we put this aside and free this man and this family from this terrible burden of all these years? And Senator Warner got this letter in the mail, and he was so astonished that he called Senator Smith and said, "You have to come see this." And after receiving that letter, Senator Warner took the resolution to a vote, and the exoneration of Captain McVeigh was finally passed.
So that's just a small part of what's in the book. Again, we really wanted to get into all of these perspectives and tie the narrative together with firsthand experiences so that you can see all of this as though you were living it too. You get to know the survivors, you get to know Bill Tody, and as a young plebe at the Naval Academy, you get to know the Belcher family, you get to know the Glenn Morgan family, and you go on a journey with them as they experience this terrible thing that they went through in the water, but then how they fought back and claimed justice for their captain 50 years later. So, you know, it's more than a history telling, it's more than facts and dates, it's an experience, and we hope that you get to know these men and this crew like we did. And
so I want to open it up to questions. Are there any questions? And not only questions for us, but questions for Captain Tody. We already warned him we were going to do this.
Just caught that.
Maybe we told you too much.
Well, I need to go to the microphone if you'd like to ask.
Oh, I heard, yes, there are microphones on the side.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
My name is Aidan Jones, and I'm a lawyer here in Washington, and I fit in a very strange category in that I didn't hear about this story until the day after Father's Day this year, even though I was a Navy officer during Vietnam. And not only that, I was a damage control assistant on a destroyer escort and survived a serious fire. We wouldn't have survived it if we had not had it on the way back from refresher training rather than on the way to it. So this book means a lot to me. But I was curious about, Lynn Vincent, your Navy background and experience and how much this has played into the story.
I was enlisted. I was an air traffic controller, which is a technical rating. I actually had to rely on Captain Tody a lot to take me to sea, because at the time when I served in the Navy, women were not allowed on combatant ships, and all air traffic controllers served on aircraft carriers, LHAs and LHDs. But I knew the language of the Navy, and I knew the culture of the Navy. And in terms of, for example, one of the biggest places my Navy experience helped was in the rumors that an SOS had been sent out from Indianapolis and ignored by the Navy and covered up by multiple parties at multiple stations. And just being familiar with the culture of the Navy, after looking into it and analyzing it, that cover-up just didn't really stand. It didn't make sense. There was not only did no one have anything to gain by that, but also the number of records that would have had to have been falsified in order for that to happen was just insurmountable. That it just didn't make sense that there was some kind of a conspiracy to cover up an SOS. Another place that came into play, my Navy experience came into play, also has to do with the National Archives. And that is that there was a subsighting about 700 miles ahead of Indianapolis's path that had been surmised to perhaps be I-58, the ship that sank Indianapolis ultimately. It had also been said by some respected historians that maybe that submarine didn't really exist. And then there have been some people that covered that submarine sighting to one extent or another. But none of the previous authors had been Navy veterans. And it just occurred to me one day, hey, why don't we just look at the logs? So we were able to find the ship logs. And not only that, but because of Nathaniel Patch, an archivist at the College Park branch of the National Archives, who should wear a big S and a cape. He said, why don't we look at their ASW reports, their anti-submarine war reports, warfare reports? So he dug that up for us, and we were absolutely astonished, and Captain Tody was astonished to find these just detailed records of 15 separate attacks on this enemy submarine that was in Indianapolis's path. And so what we found was not only that the Navy had failed to inform Indianapolis of the Tamon group, those attack submarines that I mentioned, but that they also knew of another submarine directly in her path and failed to inform her of that one as well.
Well, I kind of left a few things, and this is more a statement and a thanks, but I said I didn't hear about this until the day after Father's Day, when my daughter, who is a senior editor at Holt Macmillan, but was at Simon & Schuster, and she heard about the book, and I hadn't heard anything about the book. It actually was an advance copy that she somehow got a hold of and sent me for Father's Day. But I'm so thankful that you made this story so public. And one thing that, of course, is new about your book is the coverage of the court-martial and how horrific and unfair it was. And of course, you know, one reason it didn't come out and see the light of day was because there was a cover-up. It was really, you know, terrible that what happened to the captain, what he's had to suffer as a result of all of this. So I thank you for telling this story. And I know you're going to go to Politics and Prose's store at the wharf tonight, and originally they weren't going to apparently offer you a place to speak initially, at least when I first asked my daughter's friend there about it, and then subsequently learned it. So I'm hoping it's getting good coverage. It certainly deserves it. It's an incredible story, and you know, as an attorney, as a former, well, still trial attorney, but not very much anymore, to read about the court-martial and how difficult the attorney defending the captain was, how difficult his position was, and how little time he had to prepare, and how little evidence any records he had to prepare a defense. It's really, you know, it makes the story even doubly, triply horrible. So thank you for getting it out there, and I hope it's very successful in reaching people, not only so that they can understand how these things can happen. I mean, we can understand why the cover-up occurred. It was the end of the war. They didn't want to talk about this, particularly since it was the biggest sinking and loss of life the Navy ever has had, I guess. Not even close. So thank you, and I guess that's all I want to say. And I hope I guess you know, I used to, when I was little, I remember in the late 40s, early 50s, watching these Victory at Sea movies, documentaries, and of course, you would never have seen anything about the Indianapolis in any of that. I don't think. I don't know whether there was any footage of the Indianapolis at any point, but it certainly was not, you know, a story they wanted to tell at the time.
Right. So true. Thank you for your service.
And find sources such as a lieutenant commander who's the dentist. Was that contact established, or was that hard, or how hard was that?
Well, it started initially with the survivors organization. A lot of the family members there were very connected and was able to meet families of the lost at sea, such as the dentist and his family. And they've now, it's kind of more of a Indianapolis crew reunion. So more of the lost at sea families came, and they all had letters. And so it was a matter of many road trips with my husband, going all over the country, interviewing, reading letters, collecting this information. And then, you know, beyond that, it was spending time in the archives and going beyond just the story itself. But as Lynn had mentioned, you know, we would say, okay, well, what other ships were in the water at that time? What were there? You know, they still had their war damage reports. They still had their ship logs and their deck logs. So, and those ships were not sunk at the end of World War II, so the records still existed. So we would go into those and say, okay, what did they see at this time? What was happening, and, you know, what was the temperature over here? That kind of thing, as well as the Japanese. So I mean, it was kind of one step by one step by one step, and then we would be just before a deadline, like every time. And someone would call, or we'd find a record, and it would be a game changer. And it'd be Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock, and we get a call from the son of the prosecuting attorney of McVeigh's court-martial. True story. And he said, I have this box of stuff. No one wants it. And it's all my father's notes from the court-martial. And the book is due like Monday morning at 8 o'clock. And he's in D.C. and we live in San Diego. We're like, oh.
But guess who
lives here?
Captain Tony.
So
we said, Bill, can you go over to this guy's house named Carl Bowersfeld and look at his box of stuff from 1945?
And there were incredible game-changing notes in this. And we get a call from Bill, stop the presses. And so, we spent the weekend, and, he sent us notes and pictures, and this kept happening and kept happening, and so our efforts have been blessed incredibly from the beginning. And, we prayed and we asked for things to be revealed to us that had not been told before. Help us tell a story, help us tell the whole true story of the Indianapolis and her legacy. And that's kind of how things happened. I mean, we did a lot of work, but it was, we had a lot
of providence, providential.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming and speaking, and also for telling the story. The thing that I really find amazing about the story is that it was untold for so long, and it just makes you wonder the other great stories that are out there that are untold. And so with that, because we have the opportunity here, I wanted to ask Captain Tody a question about your experience and having worked in a bureaucracy. I'm a former Air Force officer, so having worked, I understand probably some of the pushback or the experience that you had to go through, and maybe some of the potential backlash from your involvement over something that you were so passionate about. Can you talk about that, and if you experienced any negative repercussions from your involvement in this whole situation?
Yeah, and I will admit that there was a great deal of vigorous debate. I'll describe it that way. Mostly from the legal folks within the Navy, because people hear things the way they want to hear it. And over the decades, I would say, while the survivors were trying to fight for the exoneration of their captain, none of them were lawyers, and none of them really knew how to frame the arguments in ways that would not raise antibodies within the judge advocate general community in the Navy. And so all they had to do was, raise one issue that the Navy could prove to be untrue, and the survivor's entire argument would fall apart. It would get set back for years. And so what we tried to do, when I got involved, what I tried to do is find a solution that didn't require the Navy to admit that the court-martial was defective. And I thought it was a win-win, right? The lawyers could be happy because they didn't have to declare that the proceedings were improper. And the survivors could be happy because we could all admit that the outcome was not just. And so the problem is the lawyers didn't even want to agree to that, or the Navy lawyers. And so it really helped, and we made no progress taking that approach behind the scenes. So we had to work with Congress, I would say surreptitiously, and bypass a lot of that in order to get the Congress off top dead center on making a move.
Yeah, and surreptitiously is a good word, Can
I ask a follow-on real quick? So the reluctance of the Navy to even admit that the court-martial was unjust, even with the evidence and the documentation, and as time passes, we start to learn more. Like, why was that there? Was it monetary, or was it simply a pride thing that the system couldn't be wrong, because if it's wrong, then what else does that mean?
Well, it was expressed to me in plain English that if the Navy admitted any culpability or failure in the 1945s, that there might be still legal people might take might sue the Navy, right? Families might sue the Navy over what happened, over the cover-up and mental stress and mental anguish. It seemed to me to be a red herring, a canard. And really, you know, I had no moral problems fighting that point of view. And so what we ended up doing is taking a moral approach rather than legal approach to get things moving forward.
Thank you.
A quick question. Senator Warner's prior service as Secretary of the Navy, did that ever come up in any of the discussions in terms of his initial reluctance to move forward?
Well, that was one of the concerns that Senator Smith had because at the time Senator Warner was the chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and Senator Bob Smith of New Hampshire served on that committee along with, you know, other names that people would recognize today, such as Joe Lieberman and, okay, this is what happens when you're 55. Those other guys and gals, Olympia Snow. There was a concern that because Senator Warner had served as Secretary of the Navy and had had the opportunity to rule on this before and had declined to do so, would he do so now? And I think it was because of the relationship between Smith and Warner that Warner eventually agreed to have the hearings at all. And, you know, I can't get into Senator Warner's head, and I don't know if Bill can, but you know, it's possible that Senator Warner could have said to himself, well, we can have these hearings all day long, and I can just then not take it to the Senate floor, and then everybody, you know, then I've sort of done my due diligence. And that's sort of exactly what happened until Lieutenant Commander Hashimoto wrote Warner that letter, and that's what tipped it over the top.
And I just wanted to commend the captain. There's another famous naval officer, Captain Ed Beach, who wrote Run Silent, Run Deep, who also wrote a book called Scapegoat, which is his attempt with the family to try to exonerate Kimmel and Short at Pearl Harbor, which did not go forward. But again, to the captain for his efforts and success in moving forward.
I actually knew Captain Beach because of I'm a submariner, and most submariners revered him. And so I'd known him long before I got involved in this issue and reached out to him when I started working this issue, because he actually wrote the foreword to Commander Hashimoto's book called Sunk. The foreword of that book, I think it was written in 1953. Hashimoto, there's a chapter devoted to the Indianapolis sinking, and Beach wrote the foreword of that book. We had spoken about that years before, and then when I started getting involved in McVeigh exoneration, I wrote to him again and got a letter where he strongly supported the exoneration of McVeigh. So it's a great issue. Thank you.
One more question.
Well, I'm curious. I see, first of all, Sunk was going to be held up there.
Yes. That's Commander Hashimoto's account, not just of Indianapolis, but of Japanese submarine operations in World War II, and of which he was very critical.
My question is, following up on the records, did some of your research information, for instance, the box from the son of the prosecutor, does any of that type of information end up in the archives? Where does that information end up? Does that, so the next researcher has it? So I'm just kind of curious, as some of your research, does some of it end up as permanent records here?
I have, and we have been talking with a few locations actually, because we have, in addition to 170 hours of transcribed interviews, we have these records that we've collected. And so there's a couple sources, one of them being the Indiana Historical Society and a few other branches and possibly the archives to make sure they're accessible to the public.
Okay, we've been given the hook.
So, thank you.
Thank you.
Folks, there will be a book signing one level up at the Archives bookstore. Books are at the cash registers. We'll see you up there in a few moments. Get a vacate.